So today I will be talking about embryo transfers. The two types of embryo transfers I'll be talking about is in vitro fertilization and traditional embryo transfers. I will also be talking about the steps in each process, how the embryos are graded, the history of embryo transfers, and also the biblical perspectives on each. So I will begin with traditional embryo transfers, also called fresh embryo transfers. Step one would be cycling the donor and the recip for synchronization of ovulation, and this can be manipulated by um, medications such as like FSH and oxytocin. Um, once they are also ultrasounded every day, just get a better idea where they are in their estrous cycle. Uh, Step two would be breeding the donor. This is usually done by artificial insemination, although that's not necessary to be done by artificial insemination. That's usually what they do. Step three would be flushing out and collecting of the embryo from the donor. Uh, the process of that can be shown in this chart here. Uh, Fluid is pumped into the uterus and then filtered out through a filter that looks like this. There's a very small piece of paper here that collects the embryo as the uterine fluid is pumped through. Uh, this process usually takes around like an hour or two, so it's a very delicate process, and they at times may need to sedate the donor just because it does take so long, and a lot of animals don't like being in the stocks for that long, and they may get kind of antsy. So it's very important that the donor uh, is does not move a lot, just because it's such a delicate process. And it is possible to get multiple embryos with one flush, and that's kind of the appeal to embryo transfers is that you can get more than one embryo at a time. Step four would be the evaluation of the embryo, and this is done by this grading scale down here. Um, Generally, you're going to want a grade 1 or a grade 2 embryo. Anything after that, you start to question the viability of the embryo, uh, that the recip will be able to take it. Um, and after you determine whether it's grade 1 or grade 2, it will be washed in this embryo washing dish that looks kind of like this. Uh, a lot of these change. Sometimes they have 4 wells, sometimes they have 3. It kind of depends on the product. But basically, inside this washing dish, there's this paraffin oil, uh, and the embryo is pipetted into each one of these wells. And as it's being pipetted into each one of these wells, it's being washed each time. So, and the reason for it being washed is kind of clean up the embryo, make sure there's uh, nothing that it would compromise the recip mirror being able to uh, take this new embryo. Once the embryo is evaluated and washed, uh, if you're going to be placing it into the recip within the day or that day, you're going to want to do it within the hour that you wash it. Uh, Otherwise, you can freeze it, and that is usually transported out then. The conception rates are lower when you freeze and thaw for transport. Uh, the conception rates are a lot higher when you do it same day. Uh, if you are going to do it same day, uh, or after you receive the embryo and thaw it, you're going to want to load the embryo into the gun here. Uh, this diagram down here just kind of shows what that kind of looks like. So the embryos here are placed into the tip of the gun, and connected to it is, or they are, uh, I can't think of the word, suspended in a medium here in the tip of the gun. Um, and they're a little farther back, and there's some uh, fluid behind it as well that is pumped into the uterus to kind of push the embryos in there. Uh, and it's has this straw cover as well to kind of protect the embryos more. And there has been a challenge that the embryos will get caught up on the tip of the gun, so you always got to make sure that um, that does not happen. Once you have transferred the embryos into the recip, uh, they are sometimes given uh, medication or drugs to help them take the embryo better. I know in equine they're given Regumate, which suppresses estrus, which just kind of helps the mare be able to take the embryo better and uh, gives it a better chance. Uh, and in embryo transfers, the traditional embryo transfer, most of the time it's just done in cattle and horses. Those are the two main animals that's done in, but it can be done in pigs or sheep or goats or other small ruminants as well. But two of the main that it's practiced in is cattle and horses. The next process that we have here is in vitro fertilization or IVF. Uh, I'll start with step one. Now, step one is optional. The cow is given FSH, so that it is super ovulated to sync the donor and the recip, just like traditional embryo transfer. Except in vitro fertilization, this part here is optional, uh, just so that uh, because uh, the reason that it's given FSH is just to give the technician an easier time to find the follicle or the unfertilized oocyte. It's not generally needed if you have a good technician, but it can be helpful. Step two, the technician uh, guides the collecting needle here vaginally by ultrasound, which is done rectally. So this diagram kind of shows uh, how it's done. The collecting needle here is going in vaginally while they're ultrasounding here rectally as well. Um, and it is the unfertilized oocyte is aspirated by a vacuum and fluids. So the oocytes are actually vacuumed out, and once again, you can collect more than one unfertilized egg. Um, the vacuum pulls it out into a filter, and then kind of the same process here. It's evaluated and washed. Uh, Once again, you're going to want grade 1 or grade 2. Anything above that, you kind of question the viability of it and the quality of it. Um, so after it's washed and evaluated, it's placed into a petri dish, and this is where it starts to kind of differ from uh, traditional embryo transfers. Is that in vitro fertilization, the fertilization is actually done outside of the body of the donor, whereas traditional embryo transfer, the fertilization is done all in here. Whereas in vitro fertilization, none of the fertilization goes on in here. It's all done in a petri dish where the oocytes are placed and then fertilized with sperm. Uh, it still is fertilized naturally. It's just done outside of the body, which eliminates a lot of the risks that come with traditional embryo transfers. Um, and once again, once it's fertilized, it can be frozen and transported to be thawed and placed into a female. Otherwise, if you do it same day uh, that they're aspirated, the oocytes, you can do that as well. And that's done in the same process as the traditional embryo transfer. It's loaded into the gun and placed into the female. And yeah, once again, it's just very important to make sure that you grade the embryo correctly, make sure you get it washed, and yeah, there's a lot of risk in each of these steps. Some of the pros and cons of IVF. Some of the pros would be that it can actually be done on a virgin animal, uh, or even while the female is pregnant, which is one of the main reasons that IVF is becoming so popular. Is that it doesn't matter what condition that the donor is in, you can still usually get an unfertilized egg. Um, there's also a higher chance of donors aspirating more eggs than traditional embryo transfers, and it can also be done every few weeks. And another a reason that IVF is becoming more popular is that there are no drugs or synchronization programs needed, which is uh, one of the hardest parts of this traditional embryo transfers is because there's so much planning and it's really difficult to get the donor and the recip cycled up, and that's not needed here. So that's another appealing factor of IVF. Um, Another pro of IVF is that it gives breeders the ability to be more aggressive in achieving their breeding goals, just because there's a lot less risk involved. Uh, so yeah, and the conception rates for fresh transfers are very similar to the traditional embryo transfers. So uh, this here IVF is a lot safer, or I mean not safer, a lot. The conception rates are very similar to the traditional embryo transfers, and there's also a lot less risk involved. Um, and you can fertilize multiple eggs with one straw of semen, whereas in traditional embryo transfer, when you breed the donor, you're usually using like 2 to 4 straws. So, um, some of the cons of IVF though is that it requires an expert technician. The conception rates can sometimes be lower than traditional embryo transfer. Um, it's also very expensive. Both these processes are very expensive, just because there's so much planning and risk involved, and there's a lot that goes into this. Talking about the pros and cons of fresh embryo transfer or traditional embryo transfer, excuse me, is that it provides a safe and reliable method of assisted reproduction for animals that need to be available for competition. So, competition meaning like for equine, whether they're race horses or rodeo horses or show horses. Um, these processes allow them to be bred and allows you to collect offspring on them while still being able to race them or show them or whatever you may be doing with them. So that gives you the option of doing that. Um, it also is important or it also helps if the donor has like health problems that might prevent them from foaling or uh, parturition. So if one of these animals has some health conditions that doesn't allow them to give birth very easily or just can't at all, this process gives them the ability to do that. It also allows uh, you to breed for certain traits, which is becoming more and more popular. So I know mostly in equine, people are looking for certain traits in show horses, shape of body and stuff like that. And these processes allow you to pick and choose what traits you want. Some of the cons, once again, it can be very expensive, and getting an embryo may not always be possible. Uh, Sometimes, like I said in traditional embryo transfer, something can go wrong in every single step of this. And usually, towards the later steps, if something goes wrong, you got to start over. Um, which 1 and 2, if you mess up, you're kind of in the same spot you were if something doesn't go right. But after this, it kind of gets uh, more difficult because there's just so many possibilities of something going wrong in each of these steps. Um, and also, it's a lot harder to ship on these embryos, so you're mostly going to want to do them fresh, which is a con that sometimes it may not be available to do a fresh embryo transfer same day, so you may need to transport it, which has lower conception rates. Uh, so yeah, that's basically the pros and cons of each of these. Moving on to the history of embryo transfers is embryo transfers were actually being done in the 1890s, but more research-wise than actually commercially. Uh, Embryo transfers in food animals didn't begin until the 1930s. 1950s, they were successful in cattle and pigs, and embryo transfers were not done in this country until the 1970s. And before the 70s, you could only do embryo transfers surgically. There was no non-surgical methods until after the 1970s. And a biblical perspective of embryo transfers, I would say that embryo transfers are a good way that we can care for God's creation because we're called to be stewards of His creation. Like I said, if the animal has health concerns, this is a possible way to help them be able to reproduce and help you improve your herd and everything like that. So, yeah, that is the process of embryo transfers and why is a very popular practice growing today. Thank you.